managed to be brief here, which is just as well, because it would take me, I suppose, quite some time to give a full account of Kate Soper's varied and international career as a lecturer, as a researcher, as a radical philosopher, as an activist, as a columnist, as a translator. But Kate here is a key critical voice when it comes to subjects that we've kind of come to discuss at this conference. So she's written on environmental philosophy, and in particular recently on eco-criticism, aesthetics, the ethics of consumption, gender and philosophy, and I suppose the most radical idea of all, the possibility of sustainability in a world like this one. And of Kate's publications, I'm just going to mention a few that are germane to the themes that are raised at this conference. In 2002, with Martin Ryle, she co-authored To Relish the Sublime, which explores the kind of various pleasures and pressures of work and consumption. And in 1990, her collection Troubled Pleasures, I suppose, shows a really good indicator of her intellectual span, covering as it does subjects such as Marxism, gender, and people like E.P. Thompson and Simone de Beauvoir. And in her many journal articles of recent years, Kate has written on consumerism and in particular put forward, I suppose, an aesthetic and a positive and constructive idea which has become, I suppose, quite well known now, which is alternative hedonism. And she's also a distinguished translator from French and Italian, and her name can be found sharing the book covers of Michel Foucault, Carlo Ginzburg and Sebastiano Timperano, among others. And Kate's, I suppose just to mention one of the many research activities in Kate's career, she's involved at the moment in the AHRC's research programme Cultures of Consumption, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. And her academic career has brought her to the University of Sussex, London Metropolitan University, and she's now visiting professor in the Department of Humanities at the University of Brighton. And I'm happy to say that today she is our keynote speaker with a lecture entitled Towards, oh no, a different one. No, slightly different. The Dialectics of Progress, Irish Belatedness and the Politics of Prosperity. Let's hear for Kate.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that wonderful introduction. I hope I managed to live up to a bit of it. And thank you all for hanging on at the end of the long day, long and very stimulating day, but you know, it can be a drain on the intellectual attention, so I'm very grateful for still being here. Thanks too to Alan Bradshaw, I think sort of suggested me as someone who might step in here, and it's just fantastic to be here. I've really, really enjoyed everything I've kind of attended to today. I'm sorry I wasn't here yesterday. I won't be here again tomorrow, but it's obviously an incredibly stimulating environment for discussion here that you've created, and I very much appreciated that. This, I think, follows on in a slightly odd but quite interesting way from the last presentation, which in ways I'm not going to go into now, but I hope you kind of see some of the connections. Because it's partly, I mean, I've got this rather ambitious title of the Dialectics of Progress. I'm not taking dialectics too seriously here, but I'm trying to sort of rethink what it might mean for the ideas of modernity and progress if we were to move to a more sustainable way of living. And against, the context of that, I suppose, is that modernisation has always hitherto been associated with economic expansion and industrial development. Economic growth and the extension of the market have also proved the predisposing vehicles for enlightened social and sexual policies, secularisation, and progressive cultural movements. In other words, what counts as modern is progressive, and economic growth has been its condition. Can you hear me at the back, by the way? Is that all right? But faced as we are now with an environmental crisis that demands revision of the, I would argue, the revision of the unquestioned commitment to market-driven growth, and a profound shift of thinking about the nature of human prosperity, this set of associations begins to look strained and I rather think to our children's children will come to seem rather anachronistic. A programme for sustainable consumption ought now to be seen as progressive precisely in terms of its critique of that growth model of the economy with its dependency on an ever-expanding and resource-intensive consumer culture. Admittedly, not everyone will endorse this. In fact, if you start critiquing growth, they reach for a straitjacket normally. I know there are eco-modernisers who believe in something called sustainable development that will, obviously challenge that picture. But even they, when pressed, have to admit that they have no real idea how economic growth could be indefinitely achieved, certainly not at the rates we have achieved it in recent times. Let's recall that in the recent boom years between 1995 and 98, growth in world economic output exceeded that during the entire 10,000-year period from the dawn of agriculture to the start of the 20th century. And then consider how far an expansion of that rate could continue. Growth at only 2.5% each year from 2050 to the end of the century would more than triple the global economy beyond the 2050 level, requiring, if it were to prove sustainable, almost complete decarbonisation of every last dollar. I'm taking this from Tim Jackson's work on prosperity without growth. So a just and sustainable global economy will, I think, require a break with affluence as currently construed, and the general adoption of a less work-dominated and more materially reproductive way of living. I stress very much here the issue of justice, because not only is greater global equality an essential condition of any enduring economic system, because without it I don't think we're going to have a peaceful resolution of our problems, but also, importantly, because without a shift away from neoliberalism and a much fairer division of wealth at the national level within domestic economies, there will be very little electoral support for any alternative politics of prosperity. So a more egalitarian order in Europe in the first instance, among the more affluent nations, is, I think, a precondition for the development of a new culture of thinking about sustainability. And in that sense, I think we have to, see, something like Hollande's victory in France as some sort of step in the right direction, if it does bring about greater equality. However, I want to come back to some of these issues in a moment, because they've been at the heart of my argument around alternative hedonism that Nora just mentioned, so I'm going to come back to that issue more a bit later. But in the first instance, because this is a conference in Ireland conducted in a period of deep recession, I want to take up a rather different aspect of modernisation, namely the culturally contested relationship to it of nations like Ireland, whose history is one of colonisation and victimisation by the supposedly modernising imperial power. In Ireland, by reason of its subordination to the exemplary modern state, modernity, it's been said, has been viewed as something imposed from outside, as a gift of colonial or religious conquest mediated primarily through an expanding British state, rather than as something brought about through a pre-existing Gaelic society on its own terms and through its own exertions. Gaelic culture thus came to be seen as archaic or pre-modern relative to the Anglicising influence, and as such to be either transcended or preserved, depending on the political sentiment and cultural loyalties of the observer. Eamon de Valera, for example, in the 1930s and 40s, associated the Republican and nationalist cause with celebration of a pre-modern Ireland of saints and scholars, a place distinguished by its spirituality, rather than its economic advance or progressive social policy. As he famously put it in his St. Patrick's Day speech of 1943, The ideal island that we would have, the island that we dreamed of, would be the home of people who valued material wealth only as a basis for right living, of a people who, satisfied with frugal comfort, devoted their leisure to the things of the spirit. A land whose countryside would be bright with cosy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contest of athletic youth and the laughter of happy maidens, whose firesides would be forums for the wisdom of serene old age. The home, in short, of a people living the life that God desires that men, to come back to men, should live. Or in Yeats's Anglo-Irish and altogether obviously more aristocratic aesthetic vision, Ireland was to be valued as a place that had escaped the general corruption of secular modernity. His image of fantasy was of an island destined to do spiritual warfare, as he put it, against an unholy trinity of British materialism, middle-class mass culture and orthodox Christianity. And there's another quote here from him, as he put it, in Ireland, wherever the Gaelic tongue is still spoken, and to some little extent where it's not, the people live according to a tradition of life that existed before the world surrendered to the competition of merchants and to the vulgarity that has been founded on it. And we who would keep the Gaelic tongue and Gaelic memories and Gaelic habits of our mind would keep them, as I think that we may one day spread a tradition of life that would build up neither great wealth nor great poverty, that makes the arts a natural expression of life, that permits even common men to understand good art and high thinking, and to have the fine manners that these things can give. But for many others, of course, Irish backwardness, the most belated race in Europe, quipped James Joyce with fond irony, and that's what I kind of quoted in my title. This was part of the problem of Anglo-Irish relations, not the transcendence of it. It was an insult to be divided and sublated rather than reworked and revalued. Ireland's aberrant relationship to capitalism was regarded as indicative of something anomalous and in need of correction. And there are also, of course, many who, without necessarily being great friends of capitalism and broadly supportive of the nationalist cause, found the endorsement of a pre-modern Ireland associated with that cause hugely problematic, not least in virtue of its social conservatism and offensive gender politics. The preservationist impulse towards Gaelic Ireland was also condemned as reinforcing English hegemony by colluding in the imperialists' sentimental patronage. Summarising reactions to this complexly contested cultural politics, Joe Cleary recently wrote in his article in The Companion, political economics over the last 2 centuries have consistently remarked upon the many ways in which Ireland can be seen to depart from those pathways to capitalist development regarded as normal in the Western world. And they have been left to debate whether Ireland has failed political economy or political economy has failed Ireland. Histories and sociologies of Irish modernity frequently turn into extended deliberations on Ireland's deficient modernisation, anxious ruminations on the ways in which Irish society has remained an uncanny sight of the pre-modern or the non-modern, despite its location astride the very highway of Euro-American modernity. But for others, this uncanny backwardness was transvalued and recreated as its greatest resource. The country was construed as a sublime periphery to the European mainstream, a place that was out of the world, beyond the world, an alternative to the world. And this vision of Ireland as an alternative to the world, well, it obviously, as Cleary goes on to point out, was largely discredited with independence, and from the 1960s onwards, the state sought multinational corporate investment and EU membership, which of course it attained in 1973, and this led on to a more general convergence culturally and economically with other Western societies. Yet Ireland, until relatively recently, still managed to retain something of its image as a welcome respite from the complexities of the modern world. A place, it has been said, where history fades against its much-sung landscape of rocky coastlines, rolling grasslands, misted mountain ranges, boglands and more. And the country, paradoxically, comes to represent both the romantic pleasures of solitude and seclusion and traditional virtues of conversation, sociability and close-knit communities. And this, on a personal note, very much chimes with my own experience as a regular visitor to Ireland, who over some 35 years enjoyed it for its rural landscape and, yes, dare I say it, its entrepreneurial sluggishness. I didn't love everything about Ireland, and I could see that England was richer. Yet I had this sense that the Irish, in certain respects, knew how to live. Caricatured as it often was, famously in these kinds of postcards, its relatively leisured pace was attractive to me and in many ways a green advance on what was happening at the same time in Britain. In fact, not least of the ironies of the dialectics of modernity are the contemporary revaluations of the slow food, slow city, slow travel movements and other endorsements of the more leisured and hence sustainable existence to which many would argue we need now to aspire. And that again is a point to which I'll return. Indeed, for a short period, I nourished a fond idea that Ireland, by reason of a certain cultural sophistication and savoir-vivre, might avoid what Herbert Mark Hughes has called overdevelopment and reveal to the world a rather different model of how to do prosperity. I hoped, in other words, that it might become less socially conservative and even finally offer a decent cup of coffee while yet managing a development that would mediate and temper the worst ravages of neoliberal capitalism. And just an aside on the coffee issue, the emergence of what one lifestyle magazine of the time that I saw referred to as the cappuccino Celts did seem a kind of advance. And let's not forget either that Joyce had much earlier joked that Ireland would only be liberated when you could get a decent cup of coffee on every street. But to come back to the main point, I think my foolish ideas about this were to be swept aside with the extreme economic deregulation of the Celtic Tiger years, when, so far from curbing reliance on the car, transport energy was increased by 181%, the infamous motorway was driven through the Hill of Tara, and Bertie Ahern dismissed all objections to such road building as being, as he put it, about swans, snails, and people hanging out of trees. So instead of moving towards a more sustainable development, Ireland propelled itself into the forefront of what the modernising programme had then become, namely adaptation to the economic and social constraints of the global capitalist market. Indeed, it found itself suddenly fated for its neoliberal advancement relative to other centres of commerce, by whom it had, a few years previously, been derided for its backwardness. For a brief period, as Fintan O'Toole has put it, the globalised Irish economy had itself become a global brand, with Ahern's speech on the Irish model of development much in demand. Of course, that moment in turn was not to last very long, and when the boom gave way to recession, the follies and corruption of the Celtic Tiger mode of modernising capitalism were more fully exposed. Among its other effects was the creation of a huge abyss between the wealthy elite and the rest of the population, of a kind that had already taken place elsewhere. Between 1995 and 2006, the wealth of the top 1% grew by 75 billion euros, and they held 20% of the country's wealth, with the top 5% holding 40%. Land values became the highest in Europe, 6 times more than in England in 2007. And ownership in land conferred untold wealth. Meanwhile, the surplus of unaffordable or unwanted houses rose dramatically, with apparently 30% of homes in Leitrim vacant on the night of the 2006 census. But all this is now well known, and in its essentials, no departure from the usual course of boom and bust capitalism. In fact, these are a couple of images from the Asian crash of the 1990s, where you can see these completely unused and unfinished buildings now rapidly going back to nature. These are the new junk lands, the junk space, as Rem Koolhaas and Fred Jameson refer to it, capitalist modernity. And as David Harvey has said, capitalism, to quote him, builds a physical landscape appropriate. This is, I haven't told you actually, this is a, if you haven't realised what it is, it's a multi-storey car park, so it has never been used. You know, again, it's been taken over by nature. Harvey said capitalism builds a physical landscape appropriate to its own condition at a particular moment in time, only to have to destroy it, usually in the course of a crisis at a subsequent point in time. The point in any case should not be to single out any particular economy, but rather to note the irrational, and I would argue unsustainable and hence dangerous, commitment to these kinds of conceptions of prosperity. Yet even in the wake of the crash, and a looming crisis of resources of a kind we've not faced before, no major political party in Europe has really acknowledged this, nor even broached the idea that we might need now to reconsider that commitment. The current crisis, the most serious since the 1930s, and still unfolding in unpredictable ways, has certainly caused some misgivings about continuing as we are. But these so far have amounted to little more than feeble expressions of hope that the greediest financiers will content themselves with a little less, some hope. And growth is still clung to as the panacea. In other words, only by stimulating the economy, by producing and persuading people to consume more, by fixing credit at rates that might allow them to borrow and hence buy more, can we hope to spend our way out of a crisis largely precipitated by the dynamic of borrowing and spending. And very little is said of what might be gained by pursuing a less work-driven and acquisitive way of life. We are held captive, it seems, to a consumerist version of well-being that excludes all other ideas of how to live and prosper. And it's in this context that I've been pressing for what I have termed the alternative hedonist approach to winning support for more sustainable lifestyles and for forms of governance promoting them. This responds to the current crisis, not only as a crisis, and by no means only as presaging future gloom and doom, but as offering an opportunity to advance beyond a mode of life that is not just environmentally disastrous, but also in many respects unpleasurable and self-denying. Alternative hedonism is premised, in fact, on the idea that even if the consumerist lifestyle were indefinitely sustainable, it would not enhance human happiness and well-being, or not beyond a certain point that in many places is now already past. And it claims that it's new forms of desire, rather than fears of ecological disaster, that are likely to have most impact in any move towards more sustainable modes of consuming. The seductive depiction of alternatives to resource-intensive, polluting and unhealthy consumerist lifestyles is therefore critical not only to meeting commitments on climate change, but also to building any more substantial opposition in the future to the economic governance of our times. In sum, a counter-consumerist ethic and politics should appeal not only to altruistic compassion and environmental concern, but also to the self-regarding gratifications of consuming differently, to self-interest, if you like. After all, our so-called good life is now recognised to be a major cause of stress and obesity. It subjects us to high levels of noise and stench and generates vast amounts of junk. Its work routines and modes of commerce mean that many people, for most of their lives, begin their day in traffic jams or overcrowded trains and buses, and then spend much of the rest of them glued to the computer screen, often engaged in quite mind-numbing tasks. A good part of its productive activity locks time into the creation of a material culture of ever faster production turnovers and built-in obsolescence, which preempts more worthy, enduring or entrancing forms of human fulfillment. And this is a dynamic that tends to the elimination, as many people have made the point today already, of non-commodified forms of gratification, only then to profit from the sale of compensatory goods and services. You have the stress-relieving spa and therapy industries. You have the luxury holidays that sell you back so-called quality time. You have the services that do your home cooking for you. The multiplication of gyms to which people drive in order to do treadmill walking. You have the extreme sports that take you back to nature. There's one or two of them taking you back to nature, but in the meantime, I'm saving a good deal of commodity on the way. This I always put in because it's an amazing, it's a gadget that allows you all the joys of horse racing, horse riding in the comfort of your own front room.
It's only 400 quid as well.
It's only 400 quid. Gets John Lewis immediately. So economic progress, so-called, has become ever more dependent on our preparedness to spend the money we earn by working too hard and too long on the goods which help to satisfy the goods we've increasingly sacrificed through overwork and overproduction. And the post-9/11 calls for patriotic shopping, the more recent car scrappage schemes, the appeals to spend our way out of the credit crunch and so forth, these moves all testify to the dependency on the system, on our continued spending. The message today, here's an image. And this is really where the politics of consumption is getting in now, because it's not going to be left to you to decide quite what you buy on the market exactly. You know, you are expected to be a good and dutiful consumer now, and it's part of what you owe to a kind of patriotic loyalty. The message today, if you like, is whatever happens, don't stop shopping. You know, and these are a couple of figures who have kind of, you know, made the point. I'm not going to read them out, but they're just, you know, pointing out that this is the one thing that politicians will not actually acknowledge, this dependency in a way. And it's a message, of course, aided by the billions spent on advertising and the more or less total veto on other representations of pleasure. A veto daily sustained in all our mainstream media outlets, dependent as they are on our advertising revenue, and reinforced, of course, by the discourse on prosperity of the mainstream political parties. So with little or no restraint from government, companies continue to pressurise us into environmentally vandalising forms of consumption. They now spend a fortune grooming children for a life of consumption, and they have very readily moved in on and tried to diffuse the radicalism of social movements such as feminism, and we've heard a bit about this today. These are just a few sort of ads, which I would say, you know, kind of co-opted feminism in a way. Here we are. This is Sheila's Wheels Insurance. Dog. Yet, despite the well-nigh totalitarian hold of commercial culture on the hedonist imagination, there are, I think, signs of desire for something other than the high-stress, work-dominated existence. Aggressive advertising is now widely criticised, and incidentally it was noted as a factor in the recent riots in Britain in quite interesting ways. 2/3 of people believe materialism among young people is a problem. 77% felt too much branding and advertising aimed at young people and so on. And media reports and other sources now indicate that many people are beginning to sense and resent the contradiction between what they are forced to do in order to survive. I think this may be some part of what we heard about earlier today in the generalisation process, as it were, coming to a head maybe within contemporary capitalism. Anyway, I think they are beginning to resent the contradiction between what they're forced to do in order to make out in society and how they would really prefer to live. And many commentators have commented on this now. And there's a growing number of campaigns that testifies to those now opting for a slower pace, for reduced working hours, more sustainable lifestyles, and so on. I'll just give you a few of the websites here. I'm sure you all know about these. And the Idle Foundation, again, I'm not going to read this out. I mean, I'm not holding great candles for the Idle Foundation, but it's quite interesting that these things are coming up now, and that people are gathering around the idea of alternatives to high-stress, worked-out existence. So, and this subjective sense of disenchantment is also supported by recent researches on occupational ill health and depression, by evidence on the links between greater equality of income and improved well-being, such as in Wilkinson and Pickett's spirit level argument, and by empirical studies that contest the presumed correlation between increased wealth and increased happiness, and indicate something inherently self-defeating in the pursuit of ever more consumption. Now, it's true, of course, that the simple lack of a correlation between higher income and increased reported life satisfaction does not in itself entail that more consumption has not improved well-being. The standards used by people in assessing their level of satisfaction may themselves become more stringent as their life experiences change with increased income. Education, for example, has often exposed alienation and served the cause of personal emancipation precisely by generating discontent. So I'm not denying that in many, that happiness is an elusive concept and it's difficult to pronounce on its quality or the extent to which it and its associated states of pleasure, well-being or satisfaction have been achieved. Where utilitarians have generally looked to a hedonic calculus of subjectively experienced pleasure or avoidance of pain in assessing life satisfaction, the more objectively oriented Aristotelian focus has been on capacities, functions, and achievements, with what one has been enabled to do with one's life, rather than with its more immediate feelings of gratification. And Aristotelians would argue that people are not necessarily the best judges of what conduces to their own happiness. They've also claimed that a happiness conceived or measured in terms of subjective feeling discourages the development of the Republican sentiment and intergenerational solidarity essential to social and environmental well-being. Yet the utilitarian hedonic calculus doesn't necessarily rule out more civically oriented forms of felt pleasure or the subjective gratification of consuming in socially and environmentally responsible ways. The pleasure of many activities, after all, riding a bike, for example, include both immediate personal sensual enjoyment and those which come from not contributing further to social harms. And it is, in last analysis, also difficult to legitimate claims about well-being without some element of subjective endorsement on the part of those about whom they're being made. So there's certainly a tension between these two kinds of approach, the focus on the having of good feelings risks overlooking the more objective constituents of the good life and the good society, while the Aristotelian emphasis does justice to those constituents, but always runs the risk of patronage and condoning the superior knowingness of experts over individuals themselves. So I'm not denying the complexities in this area, but to accept those, to accept those claims about the complexity of assessing the quality of life and personal satisfaction is one thing. To deny that today there's any evidence of the self-defeating nature of ever-expanding consumption would be quite another. And both sides to the hedonist debate are, in fact, in general agreement that happiness does not lie in the endless accumulation of more stuff. And as indicated earlier, although it cannot and does not aspire finally to resolve the philosophical issues in this area, the alternative hedonist perspective, by highlighting the narratives about pleasure and well-being that are implicit in these forms of dissatisfaction with affluent culture, seeks to open up a post-consumerist optic on the good life, while still respecting felt experience, and thus hopefully avoiding the worst forms of moralising and dictating needs to others and so on. So in that sense, it offers an imminent critique of consumer culture. It's not a theory about what ought to be needed or desired or actually consumed, but a theory about what some consumers are themselves beginning to discover about the, if you like, counter-consumerist aspects of their own needs and preferences. And in that context, I've invoked Raymond Williams's concept of a structure of feeling. In other words, a structure of feeling is one that's both troubled by what was previously taken much more for granted, and aware, if only dimly, of former pleasures that are going missing or other possible gratifications that are unlikely now to become available. And this position, I think, is somewhat in contrast to the critique of commodification associated with a more orthodox Marxist position, where I think the main emphasis was on the construction or manipulation of consumer needs and wants, and not on the critical reflexivity of consumers themselves. So that in the classical Marxist argument, the market had protracted its domination by subverting the will to resist it, or to enjoy any system of pleasures other than the one it provided. Resistance was then theorised as prompted solely by the exploitation of the workplace, while consumption, viewed as essentially determined and controlled by production, was regarded as exercising a placating influence and as tending to reconcile consumers to the existing order rather than firing them to oppose it. And that politics in its most orthodox form was directed primarily at transforming the relationship of ownership and control over industrial production, rather than at the quality and methods of production as such. In other words, it was about equalising access to consumption rather than revolutionising its culture. So I think there's a sort of distinction there that I'm making in terms of this kind of imminent critique. The alternative hedonist argument also invites a rather more civically oriented conception of consumer needs or desires than is captured in the prevailing spectrum of dialectical perspectives. For whether consumers are viewed as manipulated and constructed by trans-individual systemic market pressures, or as existentially authentic and heroically self-creating. In other words, whether they're viewed as unfree puppets of the system or as freely self-styling, they are not theorised in their being or aspect as consumers, as reflecting and responsible agents who might come to assume more accountability to the world beyond their immediate personal concerns. What I think is missing then is the more complex and nuanced theoretical understanding required to accommodate the troubled and equivocal forms of reaction to the consumer society with which I'm here concerned, and which I would argue complicate now or begin to transgress the consumer-citizen divide as normally conceived. Let me make clear too that counter to some anti-consumerist critiques, I do not presume that the excesses of modern consumption can be corrected through a return to a simpler, objectively knowable and supposedly more natural. It's not about going back to nature. The critique of alternative, the critique associated with alternative hedonism doesn't deny the complexity of human desires, nor the need to accommodate the distinctively human quests for novelty, excitement, distraction, self-expression, and the gratifications of what Rousseau called amour propre. It can even allow that the gratification of what Rousseau again called le freux de se distinguer, the zeal for self-distinction, which is associated with amour propre, is most easily supplied through material acquisition, at least if you have the money for it. But what comes easiest, of course, is not necessarily the most rewarding or fulfilling. And the alternative hedonist case is that in deflecting, if you like, more spiritual demands, I don't like the word, it's difficult, we don't even have a vocabulary for a secular sort of alternative to materialist culture. But it's that in deflecting that onto materialist forms of display and competition, consumerism actually offers an overly reductive, limited and partial reign to desire. It isn't utopian. Moving to my conclusion then, breaking with the consumerist dynamic of production and satisfaction is, I don't deny, a daunting prospect, given the integrated structure of modern existence and the dependencies of national economies on the globalised system. And I can see it can't really be done by nation states on their own very easily. And it's an index of the depth of our collective alienation that we scarcely know how we might begin to achieve any shift at all. But a cultural preliminary, I suggest, will be some rethinking of our current notions of progress and development, a new cultural politics, if you like, against the grain of those politicians and business magnates who denounce green politics for taking us back to the Stone Age. There are a few quotes, and I don't know if you can read them. Mm-hmm. The Greens will keep it as, I won't read them now. Against that sort of, these Greens are all taking us back to the Stone Age or medieval at most, best. A more genuinely progressive cultural outlook will celebrate certain forms of retrospection and nostalgia as potentially avant-garde. For there is, I think, a politically progressive role for keeping faith with past ways of doing and making, provided it's not too absolutist, and provided it comes in the form of a retrospection or lament that retains the memory of the social and sexual exploitations of the labour process of earlier communities, as well as of their more congenial aspects. The romantic, pre-technical world was permeated with misery, toil and filth, as Marcuse has told us. But it did also provide what he calls a landscape, a medium of libidinal experience. It provided for sustainable sources of gratification that have either gone altogether or are now fast disappearing. One such, for example, is craft ways of working, which by reason of their emphasis on skill, attention to detail and personal involvement, run counter to prevailing views on the mental manual division of labour and the timeline imperatives of the work and spend economy. In a slower paced society, craft-based production might expand, and many more now, many more be able then to benefit from the particular forms of concentration in work and self-fulfillment it could provide. They would also, of course, enjoy more disposable time, as André Gortz has argued, that would not so much exempt people from doing anything at all, but open up possibilities for everyone to engage in a host of individual or collective, private or public activities, activities of a kind that no longer needed to be profitable in order to flourish. And with that might go other forms of reevaluation of the ways that space and time figure in our lives. For example, longer but more local holidays, rather than the 5 mini breaks per annum in far-flung places stipulated by lastminute.com. A more leisured and safer urban existence. Here are a few images. These are early images of Dublin. And it's not clear whether we've gained, it seems to me. Exactly. More encouragement to be given to street loitering, I think, and conviviality. There's a potential role in this, I think, of public works of art that invite us to slow down. I've been quite interested in some of Anish Kapoor's sky mirror effects, in that people have just, these just make people, they're not consuming air exactly, they have picnics under these things, they just hang about, And the slower, I'm sure we an imaginative race, for God's sake, we as a species, we can, I'm sure, dream up all sorts of alternatives to speedy sublimes. A slower paced society could also commit to a more selective use of modern technologies. Something is happening of this kind already, of course, where we can invest in advanced medicine, in green IT, communication systems and energy provision, in expansion of public transport, avant-garde bicycle engineering and design. There's the Blur building, another instance of art. These are just some bicycle images from Copenhagen. The Danish people here will recognise some of these. This is their latest wheeze, solar panels on the bike shelters. Then avoiding the technologies dependent on fossil fuels and catering to very high-speed lifestyles. And it would be a society that also did more to encourage recycling, inventive bricolage, more self-sufficiency in food growing, less emphasis on fashion following, more on eccentric self-styling, and so forth. And that would be, these are my concluding words here really, this would be a form of modernisation that would undo the link, or begin to undo the link between progress and economic expansion without the accompanying cultural regression and social conservatism. With it would come a less evolutionist conception of history, a more complex narrative on the old-new divide, a transcendence of the current binary opposition between progress and nostalgia. Nations that had once figured as relatively backwards might reconstitute themselves in such a period of historical transition and conceptual reconstruction as in the vanguard by comparison with the overdevelopment characteristic of the imperial powers or metropolitan centres that had once rendered them marginal and pre-modern by comparison. Joe Cleary, to revert once more to his argument, has suggested, citing the role of the United Irishmen in 1793 as an instance, that peripheral nations can on occasion function as sites of an alternative enlightenment, where ideas of the modern are intellectually tested, creatively extended, radicalised and transformed, and indeed transferred eventually to the metropolitan centre. And this chimes with Joyce's speculation on Ireland when he said, had we been allowed to develop our own civilization, instead of this mock English one imposed on us, and which has never suited us, think of what an original, interesting civilization we might have produced. And one can note in passing here, it's an argument to be developed elsewhere, the potential contribution of Irish literature to this revised frame of thinking about relations between old and new, indigenous to imported culture. Emma Nolan, for example, has argued that Ulysses demonstrates a mode in which the archaic and the avant-garde may enter into explosively create a conjunction, and presents it as a book in which the notion of the emancipatory power of the modern is interrogated, indeed put under considerable pressure, rather than one in which the modern is uncritically ratified. And Declan Keiberg has argued similarly in his reclamation of Ulysses as a guide on how to live. And one might note also fiction by John McGowan, who's another writer who contrary to Hardy, though in his own quite distinctive and more contemporary mode, offers a kind of richly dialectical treatment of the rural-urban and past-present divides. So the question that I'm kind of raising, and I know it's fanciful in some ways, but I'm saying, is Ireland today in a position, or are islands, places like Ireland, in positions to draw upon the peculiar history of their relations to modernity and its exceptional literary resources in order to pioneer a new way of thinking about the politics of prosperity in the post-boom and bust era? Might it, for example, now commit to a more mediated culture of modernisation, one that retained the commitment to social emancipation while at the same time reconstituting and reworking it as a distinctively post-consumerist mode, something of the earlier romantic spirit of sober consumption and prioritisation of spiritual over material gratification? I know that these questions are highly speculative, but to indulge in them is to entertain the idea of a cultural shift that played on the idea of Ireland's particular, if rather indefinable difference in its relations to modernisation, but in a manner that allowed definitive transcendence of the colonised or victimised other positioning relative to the imperial power. And within that optic, one might then regard the unqualified embrace of neoliberal capitalist development in the Celtic Tiger years as a still too anglicised and near-colonial moment in the Hegelian sense, in the completion of modernisation and national autonomisation. A moment en route then to a way of being that would have made it more successfully and authentically an alternative to the world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much indeed. I'll take a few questions. If anyone wants, Marcus.
Yeah, Marcus Valls, Dublin University. I just have a question. The opposition between utilitarianism and Aristotelian ethics that you made earlier. If I understand or remember it correctly, I mean, there's also the rule utilitarianism of, like, John Stuart Mill, who famously said, I mean, it's better to be an unhappy Socrates than like a happy pig who always starts in a pub. So what would then be the link between rule utilitarianism and alternative hedonism that you described?
Well, I think I suppose I'm arguing here that in recent literature, this on that the literature that's challenged the association between happiness and increased income, there has been this sort of debate going on about whether you should go down the hedonic calculus. They haven't really, as it were, I think, engaged with rural utilitarianism in the same kind of way. And that has been set up as a target for some of the more Aristotelian opposition, which has said, well, actually, if we just went by subjective feelings of pleasure, then we are not actually dealing with the main, with the problems that arise in virtue of, well, for example, very selfish and vandalising forms of consumption can give a great deal of individuals, a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction. But at the same time, then the alternative Aristotelian position has its problems as well, only because it is also, at risk of offering some kind of dictatorship of needs, as it were. It's on that slippery slope, where experts know better than you do what you really want and all this stuff, which has always been a bugbear of, critiques of commodification. But I suppose, in a sense, the real utilitarianism of someone like John Stuart Mill would be kind of somewhere in, saying, look, yes, there are contradictions here. There is a sort of tension between these positions. It's somewhat similar to my own in some ways, I suppose.
Corey.
Thanks for the break. Isn't the problem that one faces in trying to instigate some kind of alternative hedonism is that the appetite is not there because we are actually okay in a Western society. We are more or less healthy. I mean, when you see the distinction between Dublin 1915 and Dublin in the present and the streetscapes. It looks like we might have disimproved, but of course there was tuberculosis and there was stench and there was infant mortality and many things have been eradicated. So persuading, for example, the Luddites in 1978 English Luddites, they were, what they feared was expropriation, as Stefano said earlier on, that they were going to lose their entire way of life. And that's what fired them enough to adopt policies that they did. And I mean, I use Luddite not in a pejorative sense, quite the opposite. So isn't it a problem that one faces? Is that, well, I mean, you can call it complacency or you can call it satisfaction or something, even if it's a sort of the unknowing sense of what our future holds, that we are.
Yes, I guess so. I mean, I see what you're saying, and I mean, I'm not necessarily that optimistic that enough of the counter-consumerist feeling will actually emerge of the kind I've been talking about to make any significant difference. I mean, I think you're right to be sceptical up to a point, but I have been struck in a way by how much more qualification there is, as it were, of the supposed, advances of what we count as affluent, of a highly developed way of living now. I mean, there are a lot of, you hear a lot of rumblings of discontent with the downsides or the more negative byproducts, particularly its impact on children, I think, but also on, it's selfishly oriented, its impact on personal health and so on. And people are constantly complaining about being overstressed. The statistics on stress and so on. Work are backing, that subjective assessment up as well. So there is. I am talking about something that is probably only slowly kind of getting going, but I think it should be recognised there, and that if one could build on it more, then one has the beginnings of some kind of, if you like, cultural revolution around the politics of prosperity that could, as it were, build on the idea that ideally we could be in a position to choose. We could choose very advanced medicine, but, not have completely car-dense, congested urban environments. I mean, we could have the best of both worlds in some ways, without the infant mortality, without the stench and so on, I mean, I'm not denying that. I was sort of pitting those two together myself in the talk, really. But we would be able to move to a different kind of idea of what it was to be modern. If you see what I mean? Which would be less reliant on something more negative.
Andres, sorry.
Well, two quick questions. Firstly, I've been impressed by histories of Bohemia, which understand Bohemia as an argument within the middle classes, a type of conflict between cultural capital and economic capital, with those that the embrace of Bohemia becomes a nice way to assert your lack of economic capital, but nonetheless be a better class of person, so to speak. So I'm wondering about this class nature of. Does this contaminate into alternative hedonism? And for instance, is this a movement that would have a registration beyond the middle classes? And secondly, there was a book that came out recently called The Myth of the Ethical Consumer, and it was, so if we consider the ethical consumer as a parallel movement perhaps, and what they did was, it was an empirical investigation into forms of ethical consumer, and at the end they conclude that there is no such thing. Instead, what we get are certain people buying certain goods, and then this has become aggregated as though it describes an entire lifestyle, where it's very context specific, and we can't generalize that across people's life, but instead it becomes appropriated, if you will, or celebrated as some sort of progressive possibility within capitalism, where empirical data shows that that's not happening.
Yeah. Well, these are good questions. Quite difficult to answer in short form. I mean, on the Bohemia issue, well, I think probably what is happening definitely is, these forms are essentially those of people with with slightly more income. You're quite right. I mean, it's a more middle class phenomenon at the moment that has these forms of anxiety, but it's not exclusive. Actually, I mean, I'm a serious. I mean, it's kind of. I need people to do more empirical research on these kinds of issues. But when some of what very little has been done has shown that there is actually quite a lot of anxiety across classes about the impact on children's health and so on. Worries about how much they're playing their computer games. How much they get. Worries about obesity and so on. I mean, there's a lot of attempts at cultural discipline which complicate the picture as well, and so one has to be kind of quite wary of how these kind of laments, if you like, or concerns are actually taken up and developed and argued about. But I think it's not entirely class specific, but those in a position to act on it are often rather wealthier. But in a way, I'm not sure I'm going to get that hung up about this, because it seems to me that in some ways the axis of responsibility has moved to the more affluent anyway, and that if there is going to be an agent here, then it will come perhaps from it has to come via those who are actually enjoying more of the so-called affluent culture at the present time, and beginning to rethink their lifestyle, partly, or maybe in the first instance entirely, in terms on selfish grounds. But those selfish grounds will, I think, increasingly over time, as the effects of climate change make themselves more felt, and the effects of the huge looming abysses between the wealthiest and the poorest also, have more impact. I think those concerns will actually have, will mean that more and more consumers of that kind, of that middle income bracket, will be pressing for different forms of mandate now. I mean, that's my hope. I mean, one of the problems with all this is where do we go with the agents of transformation? I mean, in a sense, I know I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel here to find it, but we can't look, I don't think. I mean, there may be, a sudden flip, and we have a kind of, collectivization, generalization, an agent somehow emerges of that Derridian, intermediate kind. But failing that, we can't go to working class proletariat in the old way as obviously the militant wing that is going to, so we are looking for what might be the newly up and coming possible forms of agency, and it's a slightly desperate kind of, hope that something may come out of the people recognising more and more the political role of themselves as consumers, and how that is actually, the power that they have there, as it were, to contest the stranglehold of corporate power globally. But I'm not, as I say, I'm not that confident.
Andres?
Right. I have an observation question that somehow relates to your closing question about Ireland. But my question is about Greece, and my observation, I have been following some social movements in Greece that are centering around alternative trading networks and so on. And what we get here in a way is could be described as forced alternative hedonism. You get previous middle class people that now have to get used to alternative lifestyles. So you get many people actually joining alternative trade networks, biking to work, producing their own vegetables and so on. But not necessarily for the right macroeconomic reasons. So this is not necessarily about generating, let's say, a society of economic growth or equality and justice. This is much more about income redistribution at a macroeconomic level. So my question is, what do you think about this form of alternative hedonism, and what sort of macroeconomic questions does alternative hedonism raise?
Yes, I mean, I suppose. I mean, I'm not an economist. That's part of my problem. I think that a lot of the economic implications of the cultural revolution in terms of alternative hedonism and the discovery, however it comes about by people, that actually other things can be more enjoyable in their lives, even if they're only forced into it economically in the ways that you suggested, but they come to discover that they quite like growing their own food, or they quite like not having been part of the rat race in quite the ways they were before, and so on. However these alternative forms of enjoyment become important to people, is less important than how they might come together to act as a relay to pressurise for an alternative form of economic governance. And then, of course, there is the question, which I kind of look to alternative economists to supply. I mean, I'm interested in Tim Jackson, I'm interested in Peter Victor, I'm interested in a number of, Andre Gortz has influenced my thinking here. But I think, we may be looking at red, green socialism of some kind, or mixed modes of economy, or certainly a much, 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 much more regulated form of market, and maybe mixed market, and so I can't answer your question in those terms, but I think that it would be interesting to have it linked up. I would be interesting to have some of that economic thinking done and linked up with the alternative hedonism sort of ideas and the ways in which either people who are going through some kind of cultural revolution of their own and getting there that way through their own critique of contemporary consumerist culture, or being forced into it because of the economic climate in which they find themselves. I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer, but it's the best. I mean, Tim Jackson in his book Prosperity Without Growth does actually link his argument up with mine a bit in terms of alternative hedonism. But it seems to me that we need the economists to actually do more work for us here as well.
So I have 3 more people that I've already booked in, but I just want to say, Kate's coming for a drink, so feel free to just totally grab her and talk her into a corner. So James, Miles, and Donica, thanks a million.
Yeah, I forget where it was that I read it recently, but it might have been in one of David Harvey's books where he talks about disaster films and says it's far easier for us to imagine the end of the world than it is for us to imagine the end of capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think that your presentation was excellent in saying, hey, here's some ways that we can at least begin to imagine a future that might be slightly different from the one in which we currently have problems with. But one of the things I wanted to say was that as somebody that teaches marketing and has done so for many years, one of the lessons that you pick up from that is that the maintenance of this system that we're talking about, this unsustainable system, requires massive amounts of investment of resources and time, and all kinds of other things as well. And that is that investment is probably on an exponential increase, just as some of the other curves that you referred to. And so I don't think we ought to just assume that there is an inevitable inertia towards ever-increasing consumerism. I think the opposite is in fact the case. That I think there comes a point, and Andreas referred to Greece, and so on, might analyse aspects about the financial collapse in this context as well, to say that there is a point in which the degree of investment in these kinds of activities to sustain this particular type of ideology or system becomes uneconomic, unsensible in some kind of way. And so it might be that kind of slowing down of that kind of massive inertial influence.
So global capitalism itself starts putting on its own brakes, you mean?
Well, I think absolutely, but
then because it is profit driven, what happens then? You tell me.
Exactly. I mean, I suppose this goes back to my opening caveat, which is how it's difficult to imagine. Yeah, but I suppose the argument that I haven't put forward is this: if marketing is so all-pervasive, all-powerful, and all-commanding, yeah, then why do we bother have to invest in it to do it? Surely it would do it itself if it was that effective, yeah? The fact is it isn't that effective. and it requires massive amount of institutional and structural support to make it marginally effective. That's what anybody in advertising would say, yeah? And so that's where I think that there is an inside-out issue there as well, which is often underrepresented in these kinds of analyses. Obviously, that's going to be even more complicated to see it, to observe it, or nevertheless to analyse it or whatever. I suppose what we might, at the signs of it that we might see, is to say that it will probably be, in the first instance, it will be in the interests of rich and powerful capitalists to see the dismantling of parts of that system. Yeah, that's what I suspect you would probably observe. But what it might look like, I don't know. Yeah? Perhaps a big meteorite hitting the Earth, I don't know.
But it's interesting. I mean, but yeah, I mean, one thing that's certainly clear. It seems to me that it's not necessarily. I mean, advertising does have to work very hard now at keeping the demand there, doesn't it? I mean, without the enormous investment in advertising is absolutely essential to keep people consuming. It seems to me. So it's not as it were of the essence of people.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of time and money, obviously, is invested in simply more is spent on advertising, isn't it, than on the actual production of goods or something now, is that right? Something, I mean, I read that somewhere, but I don't know whether that's right. Which is an interesting, it's interesting, yeah. How much persuasion we need.
I just wanted to ask, I wanted to comment on one of the final things you said about Irish literature providing a doorway for some kind of new imaginative art. And what struck me from that was, it reminded me of, if there's anything useful that Harold Bloom ever said, is that people deliberately misread things, in their interest. I suppose when you talk about the kind of the greats of Irish literature or whatever, is that this culture that's seen as legitimate is all too often appropriated by the very people who stand in the way of change, as a kind of mock call for something new. Here in Ireland, you have radio presenters who are paid €500,000 a year, quoting Yeats, saying, the banker's fumbling in the greasy till.
Yes.
My question, I suppose, is what kind of imaginative art, if you can point to it, would be able to mitigate or deflect that kind of appropriation?
I don't know. I'm very loath to go here in a way because I just find it's very difficult to kind of attempt in any sense to please culture along any kind of lines. I mean, I think it's completely counterproductive, and so to actually think about a form of art that would be kind of in the interests of some sort of counter-consumerist move is difficult, I think, and always at risk of just turning again away from being literature and into agit propaganda and so on, But I suppose what interested me, and as I said, I mean, I've just thrown it out. It really needs much more development. I mean, if it's going anywhere at all, which it may not be, but I am quite interested in how much, in the way in which certain Irish writers in particular do have this kind of dialectical kind of way of thinking about the old and the new, it seems to me. And the concept of modernisation is vexed and, it's uneasy, it's a troubled one in their work in ways that is handled in highly sophisticated ways, I think. So, and then maybe we need more of that kind of ways of thinking, more imaginative sort of projections of the old as the new and the new as the old, mixing up the stadialist conceptions of history, the evolutionary conceptions of progress and modernity a bit more, and not, as it were, trying to use a literature or an art of any kind to give you the image of where to go, so much as to drawing out where these works of literature or art or whatever are themselves sites of tension that we should be attending to more than we have been. Does that make a kind of sense?
So you're saying it's more demonstrative than...
Yes, I think so. But of course, there's nothing we can do to stop, the appropriation by, those we are less happy about doing the appropriating. I mean, it's done in the case all the time. I mean, no.
Donica, I'm going to leave you to wrap it up, and I'm so sorry, and I hope you'll come out for a drink afterwards and talk to because I have to wind down. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Donica.
Thank you very much, Kate, for talk. So just pick up the beginning of your presentation and focus was on Ireland because it's awkward. But it did strike me as one interpretation or one way of analysing it would be to use René Girard's ideas on
René Girard.
Girard's
Yeah.
ideas on acquisitive mimetic desire. So like it's mimesis
yeah,
is
tell
so
me how.
important.
How would I do that?
Sorry?
Yeah, go on. How?
So mimesis is so important, and that's I suppose very clear in
Yeah.
models. And it's about acquisition, not so much consumption, which reminded me of Ole's paper earlier. It seems to be about collecting stuff, not necessarily consuming, which I think creates a different logic if you focus on collecting. And Girard's argument, of course, is that this can spin out of control, this acquisitive mimetic desire as models
turn
talking
into
on
bladder.
And processes have been put in place and discourses have been put in place to contain this mimetic acquisitive desire. And two major processes seem to be missing from your analysis that seem to me to have contained that desire. And one was the Church, the Catholic Church, and the discourse of Catholicism. And the other would be the discourse of nationhood. And in various ways, not so much the state, but the nation. And both of those, in some senses, contain that desire, insofar as they focus on the collective, they focus on dangers of excessive individualization. And both of those discourses went into decline over the last 30, 40, 50 years for various reasons. And interestingly, one of the reasons would have been that the discourse of branding fed back into those two discourses and undermined both of those, because nation building is just a form of brand building. And I suppose one way to advance towards the latter part of your paper would be to think about alternatives, because both of those discourses are themselves problematic, as well as being just examples of brand building. And that's part of the reason why they've gone into decline. But the exercise then would be to develop an alternative discourse that would be somewhat akin to a nation discourse or a church discourse. And those discourses are hard to come by. But that maybe is what the...
Well, in a sense, I think that was kind of what I was trying to argue in a way. I mean, I agree, I didn't spend nearly enough time on church or nation. I mean, it was a slightly arrogant thing to probably do, what I did at the opening of the paper. But, I mean, in a sense, I think I was referring to that through the quotes from, well, particularly the quote from Blair. And I suppose, I'm trying to sort of think a way through to having a kind of cultural politics that would get rid of the social conservatism and, that would respect, in a sense, the avant-garde aspects of secularization and the emancipation of gender politics and so on and so on. So it would be socially progressive without having the association automatically of that with consumerism and with increasing individualization and so on. And in a way I agree with you, that branding serves some of those collective, it's like fashion in some ways. These are what Sartre calls forms of seriality in a way. They allow you to be part of some kind of collective. It's a kind of liquid modernity sort of issue as well, I think. It's more like a bound swarm, Just to make up for the liquidity, you do have certain kinds of collectivization processes, which, Sartre first theorized it in terms of seriality in his critique of dialectical reason, I think. But they're not, it would be a pity, and I'm arguing it's unsustainable if indefinitely the only forms of collectivization are those that take place now through branding. You know, so we need, I mean, I don't know what these discourses are going to be. It's not us to kind of dictate them, but it's something that one would hope would begin to emerge, playing on certain kinds of, newly emergent elements coming up now, in the forms of critique, dissatisfaction with consumerism and so on, and the looming crisis kind of concentrating the mind a bit there. Do you see what I mean? The crisis of the environment, which is going to get more severe. Which is going to hold up new forms of barbarism as the alternative to our finding new forms of discourse and governance, I think. Does that make kind of sense? Yeah, thank you.
Kate, thank you so much for being here today. And
I really enjoyed it.
No, thank you.
You.